world tonight, we're going somewhere most history books won't take you. We're going back to North America before the highways, before the cities, before the borders were drawn, before the name America even existed. If you grew up in the Western world, you probably learned a certain version of this history. Noble chiefs in feathered headdresses, peaceful tribes living in harmony with nature, a simple people who hunted buffalo and lived in teepees until European settlers came and destroyed everything. It's a clean story. Good guys and bad guys, victims and villains, but it's not the truth. The truth is more complicated, more human. The people who lived on this continent for thousands of years weren't cartoon characters. They weren't saints. They weren't savages. They were people as capable of beauty and brutality as anyone who came after them. They built civilizations. They waged wars. They loved their children and tortured their enemies. They created art that still takes your breath away and committed acts that would horrify you. Tonight, we're not going to romanticize them. We're not going to demonize them either. We're just going to walk through their world, the world that existed here for thousands of years before everything changed. We'll see how they lived, how they fought, how they loved, how they died. And somewhere along the way, you might realize that the story you were told, the simple one, the comfortable one, was never the real story at all. So settle in, let your breathing slow, let the modern world fade away. We're going back, way back to a continent of endless forests and open plains, of rivers that stretched for thousands of miles, of nations that rose and fell long before anyone wrote their names down. This is what life was actually like for Native Americans. Let's begin. Before we meet the people, we need to see the world they lived in. Close your eyes for a moment and forget everything you know about North America. Forget the cities, the highways, the state lines. Forget the farms carved into neat squares, the suburbs sprawling outward, the skyscrapers pushing up against the sky. Erase all of it. What's left is something almost impossible for modern minds to comprehend. Wilderness, unbroken, untamed, stretching from ocean to ocean. In the east, forests so dense that sunlight barely reached the ground. Trees that had been growing for 500 years. Air canopies so thick that you could walk for days in permanent twilight. Oak, maple, chestnut, pine, a sea of green that rolled across mountains and valleys for thousands of miles. A squirrel, they used to say, could travel from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River without ever touching the ground, just leaping from branch to branch, tree to tree, across an unbroken highway of leaves. In the center of the continent, the plains, grassland that stretched so far in every direction that it bent with the curve of the earth. No trees, no landmarks, just grass, waist-high in some places, taller than a man in others, rippling in the wind like an ocean made of gold and green. If you stood in the middle of it, you could turn in a full circle and see nothing but horizon. The sky pressed down on you, enormous and blue, and you felt like the smallest thing in the world, a speck, a single heartbeat in a land that went on forever. And the animals, buffalo herds so vast they took days to pass, not hundreds, not thousands, millions. The ground shook when they moved. You could hear them coming from miles away, a low rumble like thunder that never stopped. When they ran, the dust cloud rose, so high it blocked out the sun. One herd witnessed by settlers in the 1800s was estimated at 4 million animals. It covered an area the size of Rhode Island, and that was just one herd among many. Before the Europeans came, an estimated 30 to 60 million buffalo roamed the plains. They were the foundation of everything. Food, clothing, shelter, tools. Remove them, and entire civilizations would collapse. But we'll get to that later. In the southwest, the desert, red rock and sand, canyons carved by ancient rivers, mesas rising flat, topped against a sky so clear you could see stars you'd never see from a city. The land looked barren, but it wasn't. People had been living there for thousands of years, building cities into cliff faces, farming in ways that seemed impossible. In the Pacific Northwest, rainforests, towering cedars wrapped in mist, their bark soft with moss, their roots drinking from rivers choked with salmon. So many salmon that during spawning season, the water turned silver with their bodies. You could walk across their backs. People said you could scoop them out with your bare hands. And everywhere, water, rivers, like highways, connecting distant regions, carrying canoes loaded with trade goods for hundreds of miles. The Mississippi alone drained nearly half the continent, a liquid spine running from the northern forests down to the Gulf of Mexico. The Great Lakes holding 1/5 of the world's fresh surface water. Inland seas so large that storms could swallow boats and waves could crash like ocean surf. Streams, creeks, wetlands, springs. Water was never far. Life clustered around it, human and animal alike. This was the land, not empty, never empty, but open in ways that modern people can't imagine. The total population before Columbus is hard to estimate. Historians argue about it constantly. Some say 2 million people lived north of Mexico. Others say 10 million. Some recent estimates go as high as 18 million. But, whatever the number, the density was low by European standards. Vast stretches of land with no permanent settlements. Regions where you could walk for weeks without seeing another human being. This created an illusion that would later prove deadly. When Europeans arrived, they looked at the forests and plains and saw emptiness. They saw land that nobody was using, just waiting to be claimed. But the land wasn't empty. It was inhabited, just differently than Europeans understood. Tribes didn't fence their territory or build permanent markers. They moved with the seasons, following game, harvesting wild plants, using the land in cycles that required space and time. A hunting ground that looked abandoned in summer might be crucial in winter. A forest that seemed untouched might be carefully managed with controlled burns to encourage new growth. The land was full. It was just full in a way that outsiders couldn't see. And the people who lived on it, they were as varied as the landscape itself. Now, let's meet the people who lived on this land. And the first thing you need to understand is that there was no single people. When we say Native Americans, we're using a term that didn't exist until Europeans invented it. The people who lived here didn't think of themselves as one group. They didn't have a shared identity, a common language, a unified culture. They were as different from each other as the Chinese are from the Irish, as the Egyptians are from the North. Imagine if aliens landed in Europe and decided that everyone from Portugal to Russia was the same people. That's essentially what happened here. There were hundreds of distinct nations on this continent, hundreds of languages, not dialects, but completely separate languages, as different from each other as English is from Mandarin. The Navajo in the southwest couldn't understand the Lakota on the plains. The Iroquois in the northeast had nothing linguistically in common with the Cherokee in the southeast. A Comanche warrior and a Kling fisherman would have needed translators to exchange a single sentence, and the differences went far beyond language. In the Pacific Northwest, people built permanent wooden houses and lived in complex hierarchical societies. They carved massive totem poles that told the stories of their clans. They held potlatches, elaborate ceremonies where wealthy families gave away enormous quantities of goods to demonstrate their status. The more you gave away, the more powerful you were. On the plains, people lived in portable teepee and followed the buffalo herds across hundreds of miles each year. They had few possessions because everything had to be carried. Status came not from wealth but from bravery in battle, from horses stolen, from coups counted against enemies. In the southwest, the Pueblo peoples built apartment complexes out of adobe and stone, multi-story structures that housed hundreds of families. They farmed in the desert using irrigation techniques that still impress engineers today. They were peaceful compared to their neighbors, preferring trade to warfare, but they could defend themselves ferociously when attacked. In the eastern woodlands, the Iroquois formed a confederacy of 6 nations with a constitution that some historians believe influenced the U.S. Constitution. They had a sophisticated political system with checks and balances, representative councils, and procedures for making collective decisions. Women held significant power. They owned the long houses, controlled agricultural production, and had the authority to select and remove chiefs. In the Arctic, the Inuit survived in conditions that would kill most humans within hours. They built houses from snow, hunted seals through holes in the ice, and developed clothing so effective that modern cold weather gear still borrows from their designs. They had no wood, no metal, no plant foods for most of the year, and they thrived. In the southeast, the Cherokee developed their own written alphabet in the early 1800s, one of the few times in history that a non-literate society created a writing system from scratch. Within a generation, literacy rates among the Cherokee exceeded those of the white settlers surrounding them. They published newspapers, wrote laws, built schools. Each of these societies had developed over thousands of years. Each had its own history, its own heroes, its own origin stories. Each had adapted to its particular environment in ways that were elegant, effective, and utterly distinct. The diversity is almost impossible to overstate. Some tribes were matrilineal. You belonged to your mother's clan, inherited through her line, lived in her family's home. Others were patrilineal. Everything passed through the father. Some tribes practiced agriculture so sophisticated that European observers were astonished. The three-sister system, corn, beans, and squash, planted together, was a marvel of ecological engineering that produced more calories per acre than most European farming methods. Others never farmed at all. They hunted, gathered, fished, moving through the landscape with the seasons, taking what the land offered, leaving little trace of their passing. Some tribes read deeply peaceful. The Hopi, whose name means peaceful ones, built their villages on defensible mesas, but avoided warfare whenever possible. Their religion emphasized harmony, balance, non-aggression. Others were built for war. The Comanche, the Apache, the Lakota. These societies revolved around raiding, fighting, proving courage in battle. Young men who didn't participate in warfare were essentially non-persons. Some tribes kept slaves. Captives taken in raids might be adopted, might be traded, might be kept as property for generations. Slavery existed here long before Europeans arrived with their own brutal version. Other tribes found the concept repugnant. Captives were either killed, adopted as full members of the tribe, or released. The idea of permanent hereditary bondage was alien to them. Some tribes practiced human sacrifice. Others were horrified by the concept. Some tribes tortured captives for days. Others treated prisoners with relative kindness. Some tribes were nomadic, never staying in one place for more than a few weeks. Others built cities that rivaled anything in Europe. Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis, had a population of 20,000 at its peak, around 1,100 AD, larger than London at the same time. The point is this: there was no single Native American culture. There were hundreds of cultures as varied as anything on Earth. When Europeans arrived, they didn't encounter a monolithic civilization. They encountered a continent of nations, allied, competing, warring, trading, intermarrying, constantly shifting in their relationships with each other. The Iroquois and the Huron were bitter enemies. The Comanche and the Apache fought for generations. The Lakota pushed the Crow and the Pawnee off their lands with the same ruthlessness that Europeans would later use against the Lakota. This wasn't a peaceful continent disrupted by outside invaders. It was a dynamic, competitive, often violent world where dozens of nations jostled for power, resources, and survival. The Europeans didn't create conflict here. They entered a world already full of it and added their own brand of chaos to the mix. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before the collision, before the catastrophe, there was ordinary life, daily life, the rhythms of existence that filled the hours and days and years for millions of people across this vast continent. Let's step into that world. Let's step into a single day. Not a dramatic day with battles or treaties or first contact with strangers from across the sea. Just an ordinary day, the kind that happened thousands of times and was never recorded because nothing remarkable happened except that people lived it. The details will vary depending on the tribe, the region, the season, but the rhythms of daily life had a shape that most Native Americans would recognize. You wake before dawn, not to an alarm, not to a schedule imposed from outside, just the slow return of consciousness as the darkness begins to soften, as the birds begin to stir, as the fire that burned through the night crackles and pops in its bed of coals. For a moment, you lie still. The air is cool on your face, but your body is warm beneath the furs and blankets. You can hear breathing around you, family members still asleep, a dog sighing and shifting, the small sounds of life continuing through the night. There's no hurry. Not yet. The day will come whether you rush toward it or not. Your shelter depends on where you live. If you're on the plains, you might wake in a teepee, a cone of buffalo hides stretched over wooden poles. The design is elegant, perfected over generations. The shape sheds wind and rain. The smoke hole at the top can be adjusted with flaps to control airflow. In summer, the bottom edges can be rolled up to let breezes pass through. In winter, an inner liner traps air for insulation. The whole structure can be taken down and packed onto a horse in 15 minutes. It has to be. You might move a dozen times in a season, following the buffalo, seeking fresh pasture for your horses, avoiding enemies, or seeking better trading opportunities. Inside, the floor is covered with furs and blankets arranged over a layer of grass or sage. The scent is distinctive: animal hides, wood smoke, dried herbs, human bodies. It's not unpleasant. It's the smell of home. Your possessions are arranged around the edges, weapons near the door, clothing and personal items in their designated spaces, sacred objects in the place of honor at the back. Everything you own fits in this space because everything you own needs to move with you. If you're in the Northeast, you might wake in a long house, a massive wooden structure that can stretch 200 feet, housing a dozen families or more. The frame is made of bent saplings, covered with shea, teas of bark, elm, or cedar, whatever's available. The structure is permanent, built to last for years. The air is smoky from the fires that line the central corridor. Each family has a fire shared with the family across the aisle. Smoke rises toward vents in the roof, but plenty of it lingers, stinging your eyes, flavoring everything with the taste of burning wood. Families live in compartments on either side, separated by storage areas stacked with dried food, tools, personal belongings. Sleeping platforms are raised off the cold ground, covered with furs and woven mats. There's no privacy in a long house. You hear your neighbors coughing, arguing, making love, comforting, crying children. Dogs wander freely. Children run through the central aisle, playing games, getting underfoot. It's crowded by modern standards, but crowded means warm in winter. Crowded means many hands to share the work. Crowded means you're never alone. If you're in the Southwest, you might wake in a pueblo, a room in a massive apartment complex made of stone and adobe. The walls are thick, sometimes 2 feet of dried mud brick, holding the cool through the heat of day, holding the warmth through the cold of night. Your room has no door at ground level. You climb down a ladder from the roof to reach it. The ladder can be pulled up behind you, a defensive measure against raiders who once made life here precarious. The room is small but functional. A sleeping platform along one wall. Storage niches carved into the adobe. A grinding stone for corn in the corner, worn smooth by generations of use. Outside your room, the pueblo rises in terraces, each level set back from the one below, creating a stepped pyramid of living spaces. Hundreds of people live here in rooms, stacked like blocks, sharing walls, sharing spaces, sharing life. Wherever you are, the first task is the same: fire. Someone tends it constantly in the night. That might be an elder who sleeps lightly and wakes easily. In the morning, it might be a child old enough to be useful, but too young for heavier work. The fire from last night has burned down to coals. Now it needs to be coaxed back to life. Dry tinder laid carefully over the embers, gentle breath to encourage the flame. Small sticks added gradually until the fire is strong enough to accept larger fuel. Fire for warmth as the morning chill lingers. Fire for cooking the first meal. Fire to heat water to provide light to keep away insects. Fire as the center of everything, the heart of the home. The one thing you cannot do without. The second task is water. In most societies, this falls to women and older children. They carry containers to the nearest source, a stream, a spring, a river, a hand-dug well. The containers vary. Woven baskets sealed with pitch, animal bladders cleaned and dried, clay pots in regions where pottery is common. Later, after European contact, metal pots and kettles become prized trade goods. Water is heavy. A full container might weigh 20 pounds or more. The source might be a 4 mile away, or half a mile, or more. This journey happens every day, sometimes multiple times. Your arms grow strong. Your back grows strong. You learn to carry weight balanced on your head or suspended from a yoke across your shoulders. Then comes food. Breakfast isn't a separate meal the way we think of it. You hungry when food is available, when work permits. But morning usually involves something. Leftovers from the night before, dried meat or fish, cornmeal, mush, whatever's on hand. What you eat depends entirely on where you live and what season it is. On the plains, meat dominates. Buffalo above all, roasted fresh over fires, dried into jerky that lasts for months, pounded with fat and berries into pemmican that provides dense nutrition for travel. A single buffalo provides hundreds of pounds of meat, plus hide for clothing and shelter, bones for tools, sinew for thread, horns for cups and spoons. Even the dried dung, buffalo chips, burns hot and clean fuel on the treeless plains. When the hunting is good, there's more meat than you can eat. It hangs in strips over smoking fires, drying, preserving, accumulating against the lean times that always come. In the eastern woodlands, the diet is more balanced. Women tend fields of corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters that grow together in a sustainable system. The corn stands tall, providing structure. Bean vines climb the corn stalks, reaching for light. Squash spreads across the ground between the mounds, its broad leaves shading out weeds and holding moisture in the soil. It's an elegant system. The beans fix nitrogen, fertilizing the soil for the corn. The corn provides carbohydrates. The beans provide protein. The squash provides vitamins. Together, they form a complete diet, more nutritious and more productive than most European farming. Meat supplements the crops. Deer are abundant in the forests. Turkey, rabbit, squirrel, bear, fish from streams and rivers. Men hunt and fish. women farm. The division of labor isn't absolute, but it's the general pattern. In the Pacific Northwest, fish is everything. Salmon, above all. During the spawning runs, the rivers turn silver with fish fighting their way upstream. They come in numbers that seem impossible. Millions of individual fish packing the waterways so tightly you could almost walk across their backs. You catch them with nets, with spears, with weirs and traps that channel them into holding pens. You catch far more than you can eat fresh. So you smoke them, dry them, store them for winter. Salmon becomes currency, traded up and down the coast inland to tribes that have no access to the sea. In the Arctic, survival depends on animals that most people would never think to eat. Seal, walrus, whale, caribou, polar bear, when you can get one. The Inuit eat much of their food raw, or did traditionally. In a world without fire, sometimes without wood or other fuel, raw meat provides nutrients that oaking would destroy. They developed a cuisine built around fermentation, freezing, drying, techniques that preserved food through the long, dark winters when no hunting was possible. Food preparation takes hours every day. There are no shortcuts, no cans to open, no packages to unwrap, no restaurants, no takeout, no convenience. If you want to eat corn, you have to grow it, harvest it, dry it, shell it, grind it. The grinding alone can take hours. Kneeling over a stone metate, crushing the kernels with a stone mono, back and forth, until the hard kernels become fine flour. If you want to eat meat, someone has to kill the animal, butcher it, preserve what isn't eaten immediately. Butchering a buffalo is a full day's work for several people. Nothing is wasted. Not the blood, not the organs, not the bones, not the hide. Children help as soon as they're able. A 5-year-old can gather kindling, can fetch water in a small container, can watch a baby while mother works. A 7-year-old can do real work, tending a fire, stirring a pot, helping to process hides. By 10 or 12, children are doing adult work. Boys are learning to hunt, to track, to shoot. Girls are learning to farm, to cook, to sew, to manage a household. The extended childhood we know, years of pure play and education, doesn't exist. There's no time for it, no resources to support it. But that doesn't mean childhood is joyless. There are games everywhere, running races, wrestling matches, shooting contests with small bows, ball games that draw entire villages into spirited competition. Many of these games teach skills. A boy playing at hunting is learning to track, to stalk, to shoot. A girl playing with a doll is practicing childcare, learning the songs and stories she'll pass to her own children someday. But some games are just fun. Children everywhere find ways to play, chasing each other, making up stories, exploring the world around them. Human nature doesn't change. There are stories. Every culture has them. At night, around the fire, elders tell the tales that have been told for generations. Creation myths that explain how the world came to be. Trickster stories featuring coyote, or raven, or spider. Clever beings who outwit their enemies and sometimes outsmart themselves. Hero tales, love stories, cautionary tales about what happens to children who disobey or wander too far from home. These stories aren't just entertainment, though they are entertaining. They're education, history, law, morality. Everything a society needs to pass down to its children is encoded in stories, memorized and repeated, word for word, sometimes adapted and embellished other times. In a world without writing, story is how memory survives. There's music, almost constant music, drums, flutes, rattles, voices raised in song, music for ceremonies, complex compositions that take days to perform, that can only be sung by people who have earned the right, music for work, rhythmic chants that coordinate effort, make labor easier, pass the time, music for healing. songs believed to have power over illness and injury, music for mourning, laments that give voice to grief. You don't listen to music as a passive consumer, you make it. You participate, you sing along. Music is woven into daily life so thoroughly that silence feels strange, and there is rest. This might surprise you. We imagine pre-modern life as constant toil, an endless struggle for survival that filled every waking hour with desperate labor. And at certain times, during hunts, during harvests, during long moves to new territory, that's true. Life could be brutal, exhausting, unrelenting. But for much of the year, life moved at a pace we would find almost leisurely. Studies of modern hunter-gatherer societies, the closest analog we have to pre-agricultural native life, suggest that people typically spend only 4 to 6 hours a day on subsistence activities. The rest was leisure, 4 to 6 hours. The average American today works 8 hours, then commutes, then does household tasks, then collapses in front of a screen. We have more technology than any people in history. And, somehow, we have less free time than a Lakota hunter on the plains. What did they do with all that time? They talked. Conversation was entertainment, education, social bonding. Hours spent in discussion, gossip, philosophy, strategy, memory. They rested. Naps in the afternoon heat. Lazy mornings when nothing urgent demanded attention. The kind of unscheduled time that modern people pay money to find on vacation. They created art wasn't separate from life. It was embedded in it. The beadwork on a shirt, the painting on a teepee, the carving on a bowl. People made beautiful things because they had time to make them and because beauty mattered. They play, adults, not just children. Games of chance, games of skill. Gambling was endemic. People bet on everything, sometimes losing all their possessions in a single wager. They sat with each other just Saturday watching the fire, watching the sky, watching the children play, being present in a way that modern people with our phones and our schedules and our endless distractions can barely imagine. The day ends as it began. Darkness falls gradually, the sky turning pink and orange and purple before fading to black. The fire is fed. Families gather in their shelters. Children are settled onto sleeping platforms, tucked under furs and blankets. Adults talk quietly, voices low, the conversation of people who have spent the day together and will spend tomorrow together too. Maybe someone tells a story, a voice rising and falling in the firelight, carrying you back to the time when the world was new. You drift towards sleep. The fire crackles, the sounds of the village fade. Dogs settle, breathing deepens. Tomorrow will be much like today, and the day after, and the day after that. The rhythms of life repeating themselves season after season, generation after generation, until something changes. Everything. Now we come to the part that makes people uncomfortable, the part that doesn't fit the story we were taught, the part that school textbooks skip over and Hollywood ignores. Violence. Not violence that arrived with Europeans. Violence that was here long before any white person set foot on this continent. Violence that was woven into the fabric of many Native American cultures as deeply as farming or storytelling or prayer. This isn't about demonizing anyone. It's about seeing clearly. And the clear truth is this: North America before Columbus was not a peaceful paradise. For many tribes, war was not a last resort. It was a way of life. Let's start with why. In most Native American cultures, there was no separation between warrior and citizen. No standing army that did the fighting while everyone else stayed home. If you were a man, you were a warrior. That was simply what men were. And being a warrior wasn't just a role. It was an identity, a religion almost. Among the Plains tribes especially, warfare was how a young man proved himself, not by accumulating wealth, not by building a house, not by mastering a trade, by raiding, by fighting, by demonstrating courage in the face of death. Your status in the tribe, your ability to marry well, to speak in councils, to be respected by other men, all of it depended on your record as a warrior. This created a system where violence wasn't just permitted, it was required. A young Comanche who never went on raids would be nobody. A Lot who showed cowardice in battle would be shamed for life. A Crow who never stole horses would never attract a wife. The pressure was constant and lifelong. Even successful warriors had to keep proving themselves. One great deed wasn't enough. You needed a lifetime of them. And the deeds that earned the most honor weren't always what you'd expect. Killing an enemy was respected, of course, but in many tribes, the highest honor came from something called counting coup, touching a living enemy with your hand or a special stick, then escaping alive. Think about that. The bravest thing you could do wasn't killing from a distance. It was getting close enough to touch, proving you could have killed, but chose to humiliate instead. This created a style of warfare that Europeans found baffling. Warriors would charge into danger, not to win territory or destroy armies, but to perform individual feats of bravery that could be recounted later. A battle might end with few casualties on either side, but dozens of stories about who touched whom, who stole whose horse, who stood his ground when everyone else ran. It was war as sport, war as performance, war as the central drama of male existence. But it could also be war as horror, because when the raiding and the coup counting escalated into real conflict, when tribes went to war, not for glory, but for survival or revenge, the violence was extreme by any standard. Scalping is the most famous example. Many people believe Europeans introduced scalping to North America. They didn't. Archaeological evidence shows scalping was practiced for at least 1,000 years before Columbus arrived. A scalp was proof of a kill, a trophy you could display, dance with, use in ceremonies. Taking a scalp wasn't just about killing your enemy. It was about claiming a piece of him, carrying his humiliation with you forever. And scalping wasn't limited to warriors. Scalping a woman or child proved that you had penetrated deep into enemy territory, that you had reached the heart of their village where the vulnerable ones lived, in a cultural built around bravery that made you formidable. At Crow Creek in modern South Dakota, archaeologists found the remains of nearly 500 people massacred around 1325, over a century before Columbus. Almost all of them showed signs of scalping. Men, women, children, an entire village wiped out. This wasn't European violence. This was native violence. Tribe against tribe. It happened constantly for centuries all across the continent. Then there was torture. This is the part that's hardest to talk about, the part that makes us want to look away. In many tribes, captured enemies weren't simply killed. They were brought back to the village and subjected to public torture that could last for hours, sometimes days. Women and children participated. They slashed at captives with knives, threw burning coals, cut off fingers one by one. The entire community gathered to watch. To us, this seems like pure sadism, cruelty for its own sake, but to them, it served a purpose. Torture was a test for everyone involved. The captive was expected to endure without screaming, without begging, without showing fear. The more stoically he faced his death, the more honor he earned. Some captives sang their death songs while being burned alive, defiant to the last breath. And for the torturers, it was also a test, a way to demonstrate your own courage by facing death up close, a way to release grief for your own people who had been killed, a way to feed the spirits of the dead with the suffering of their enemies. This doesn't make it less horrifying, but it makes it human, comprehensible, a practice with its own internal logic, however alien that logic seems to us. The violence was cyclical. One raid provoked a revenge raid. One death demanded another death. Feuds between tribes lasted for generations, passed down from father to son like an inheritance of blood. The Iroquois Confederacy fought the Beaver Wars in the 16th century, destroying or displacing dozens of other tribes to control the fur trade. The Lakota expanded westward by pushing other nations off their lands. The Comanche. But we'll get to them soon. None of this excuses what Europeans did later. The massacres, the broken treaties, the systematic destruction of entire peoples. That happened too, and it was monstrous. But the violence didn't start with Europeans, and Native Americans weren't passive victims waiting to be slaughtered. They were warriors. Many of them were terrifying warriors. They fought back with skill and ferocity that stunned their enemies for centuries. The frontier wasn't a story of wolves attacking sheep. It was wolves and wolves, two systems of violence colliding, each one brutal in its own way, each one convinced that the other side started it. The result was 300 years of bloodshed that left no one clean. Everything we've talked about so far, the land, the people, the daily rhythms, the warfare, all of it existed for thousands of years in relative stability. Tribes rose and fell, territories shifted, but the basic shape of life remained the same. Then something arrived that changed everything. The horse. It's hard to overstate how completely horses transformed Native American life. Imagine if someone handed you a motorcycle when everyone else was walking. Imagine if your entire economy, your warfare, your culture, your sense of what was possible, all of it suddenly had to be rebuilt around this new technology. That's what happened. And it happened fast. Horses weren't native to North America. They had existed here millions of years ago, but they went extinct, along with mammoths and saber-toothed cats at the end of the last ice age. For 10,000 years, there were no horses on the continent. Then the Spanish arrived. Hernán Cortés brought horses to Mexico in 1519. Over the next century, Spanish colonizers spread northward, establishing missions and ranches throughout the Southwest. They tried to keep horses away from native peoples. They understood instinctively that horses meant power, but horses escaped. Horses were stolen. Horses were traded. By the late 16th century, horses were spreading across the Great Plains like wildfire. Tribe after tribe encountered them, acquired them, and had to figure out what to do with them. Most tribes saw horses as livestock, useful animals like dogs for carrying loads and pulling travel. They ate them sometimes. They traded them, but a few tribes saw something else. They saw a weapon. The Comanche were among the first to fully understand what horses could become. We'll talk about them specifically in the next section. But they weren't alone. The Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Crow, the Blackfoot, the Coway, all of them reinvented themselves around the horse. Within a generation, these tribes went from pedestrian hunters to the greatest light cavalry the world had ever seen. Think about what horses meant for hunting. Before horses, hunting buffalo on foot was dangerous, difficult, and inefficient. You could drive a herd over a cliff if the landscape cooperated. You could stalk individual animals and hope to get close enough for a kill shot with your bow. But it was hard. A buffalo can run 35 miles per hour. A man can run maybe 15, and not for long. With horses, everything changed. Now you could ride alongside a stampeding herd at full gallop. You could pick your target, match its speed, and put arrow after arrow into its side from 10 feet away. A skilled hunter on a good horse could kill multiple buffalo in a single chase. The food supply exploded. Tribes that had always struggled to find enough meat suddenly had more than they could eat. Populations grew. Leisure time expanded. Life got easier and more violent because horses also transformed warfare. A warrior on foot could travel maybe 20 meters in a day. If he pushed hard, He could carry limited weapons and supplies. He had to fight on terrain that favored defense. A warrior on horseback could cover 60 meters in a day, 80 if he changed horses. He could carry more weapons, more supplies. He ULD strike a target and be gone before anyone organized a response. Raiding became easier, more profitable, more tempting. Before horses, warfare was constrained by logistics. You couldn't attack someone 200 meters away because you couldn't get there and back before your food ran out. With horses, the entire continent opened up. Comanche raiding parties regularly traveled 500 miles to strike targets in Mexico. Lakota warriors could attack a village in the morning and be 100 miles away by nightfall. The speed and range of horse-mounted warfare was unlike anything North America had ever seen, and the tactics evolved rapidly. Plains warriors developed a style of mounted combat that no European army could match. They learned to ride at full gallop with no hands, guiding the horse with their knees alone. They learned to drop down along the horse's flank, using its body as a shield while firing arrows from beneath its neck. They could shoot 20 arrows in the time it took a soldier to reload a single-shot musket, and they could do it while moving at 30 miles per hour. One U.S. Army officer, watching Comanche horsemen demonstrate their skills, said he would rather face any European cavalry than these warriors. Another said that a Comanche on horseback was worth 10 soldiers. The horse also changed social structures. Before horses, wealth was hard to accumulate. You could only own what you could carry. Status came from personal qualities: bravery, wisdom, generosity. Horses changed that. Now, you could own something valuable, something that reproduced, something that could be stolen, traded, inherited. Horse wealth became the foundation of plain society. A rich man might own hundreds of horses. A poor man might own none. And the gap between them mattered in ways it never had before. Young men who wanted to rise in the world had one clear path: steal horses, raid other tribes, build your herd. The pressure toward violence, already strong, became overwhelming, and the geography of power shifted. Tribes that mastered horse warfare expanded. Tribes that didn't were pushed aside, conquered, or destroyed. The Comanche, who had been a small marginal group in the mountains of Wyoming, exploded across the southern plains. Within a few decades, they controlled a territory larger than France. The Lakota moved west from Minnesota, pushing other tribes before them, eventually dominating the northern part. Again, the Apache, who had ruled the Southwest for centuries, suddenly found themselves outmatched by enemies who fought from horseback with devastating speed. It was a revolution, a complete reorganization of power across half a continent, and it happened in less than 100 years. By the time American settlers started pushing west in large numbers, they encountered a world that was only a few generations old. The traditional Plains Indian culture, the one with the teepees and the buffalo hunts and the mounted warriors in feathered headdresses, was younger than the United States Constitution. This matters because it reminds us that Native American cultures weren't frozen in time. They weren't static relics of some ancient past. They were dynamic, adaptive, constantly changing in response to new circumstances. The horse was just the most dramatic example. But throughout their history, Native peoples had been innovating, borrowing, evolving. They adopted new crops, new weapons, new ideas. They built trade networks that spanned thousands of miles. They formed alliances and confederacies that would have impressed any European diplomat. They were not primitive. They were not simple. Hay were not waiting passively for history to happen to them. And when the horse arrived, they grabbed it with both hands and used it to build something extraordinary, something that would terrify everyone who encountered it. If you want to understand how powerful Native American warfare became, how terrifying, how effective, how utterly dominant, you need to understand one tribe above all others, the Comanche. For 150 years, they ruled the southern plains with such absolute authority that historians don't call their territory a hunting ground or a homeland. They call it an empire. Comanche. It stretched across what is now Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, Kansas, and Oklahoma. An area larger than many European nations, and within its borders, the Comanche decided who lived, who died, who passed through, and who paid tribute for the privilege. They weren't always powerful. Before the horse, the Comanche were a small, obscure group living in the mountains of Wyoming. They were part of the Shoshone people, surviving on the margins, unremarkable in every way. Then they encountered horses, and everything changed. The Comanche didn't just adopt the horse, they merged with it. They became in the words of one historian, the finest light cavalry in history. Better than the Mongols, better than the Arabs, better than any mounted warriors Europe ever produced. They learned to ride before they learned to walk. Comanche children were strapped to horses as infants. By age 5, they could ride at a gallop. By age 10, they could fight from horseback. By adulthood, horse and rider moved as a single organism. Their skills defied belief. At full gallop, a Comanche warrior could drop down along the side of his horse, hanging by one heel hooked over the animal's spine, his entire body shielded by the horse's mass. From this position, invisible to his enemies, moving at 30 miles per hour, he could fire arrows with deadly accuracy, 20 arrows per minute, effective range of 30 yards, while the horse never broke stride. A U.S. soldier armed with a single-shot musket could fire maybe 3 rounds per minute, and he had to stand still to do it. Against Comanche tactics, conventional warfare was suicide. But what made them truly terrifying wasn't just their skill. It was their culture. The Comanche built their entire society around war. For a young man, there was no path to respect except through raidi, ng. No way to earn a wife except by stealing horses. No way to become someone except by proving your courage in battle, again and again for your entire life. This created a warrior class of extraordinary ferocity, men who had been training for combat since childhood, men who feared shame more than death, men for whom violence wasn't a means to an end. It was the end itself, and when they fought without limits. Comanche raids were legendary for their brutality. They struck without warning, often at dawn, sweeping through settlements with overwhelming speed. Men were killed immediately. Women were often taken as captives for slavery, for adoption, or for worse. Children might be killed, might be taken, might be adopted into the tribe. The torture of captives was common. Prisoners were staked to the ground and subjected to prolonged torment, burning, cutting, mutilation that could last for days. Women and children participated. The entire community gathered to watch. To the Comanche, this wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was ritual, a way to honor the dead by feeding them the suffering of enemies, a way to test the courage of the captive and the captives alike, a way to demonstrate absolute dominance. To everyone else, it was pure terror, and it worked. Spanish settlements in Texas and New Mexico lived in constant fear. They paid tribute to the Comanche, horses, goods, captives from other tribes, just to be left alone. And even then, they weren't safe. Comanche raiders struck when they pleased, took what they wanted, and vanished before any response could be organized. Mexico, after winning independence from Spain, tried to push into Comanche territory. They failed catastrophically. The Comanche raided so deeply into Mexico that entire regions were depopulated. Villages were abandoned. The frontier collapsed. One raid in 1840, the Great Raid of 1840, saw Comanche warriors ride hundreds of miles into Mexico, destroying everything in their path, then returning north with thousands of stolen horses and hundreds of captives. Mexico was powerless to stop them. Here's something most Americans don't know. Spanish is the dominant language south of the Rio Grande. English is the dominant language north of it. If you had to pick one reason why that border exists where it does, one factor above all others, it would be the Comanche. They stopped Spanish expedition. Ends verse, ver, ver, o, ncold. For 150 years, Spain and then Mexico tried to push north, and the Comanche pushed back harder. The line held. When Americans finally arrived in Texas, they found a land that had been shaped by Comanche power. Empty spaces that weren't empty by accident. Ghost towns and abandoned ranches. A frontier defined by fear. And the Americans learned that fear themselves. The Texas Rangers were founded specifically to fight the Comanche. They adapted their tactics, their weapons, their entire approach to warfare to counter a threat unlike anything they'd faced before. The Rangers became famous. They became legendary. But for decades, the best they could manage was survival. Victory was something else entirely. One U.S. Army general asked about the prospect of war with the Comanche said it would mean complete ruin. He wasn't exaggerating. Eventually, of course, the tide turned. We'll get to that. But for a century and a half, the Comanche stood as the undisputed lords of the southern plains. They humbled empires. They terrified everyone who encountered them. And they built something that by any honest measure deserves to be called an empire of their own. That's who they were. Not Vic Tims, not savages, not noble innocents, warriors, rulers. The most successful military power in the history of North America until the world changed faster than anyone could adapt. For thousands of years, this world existed on its own terms. The tribes rose and fell. The seasons turned. The buffalo roamed. The cycles of war and peace continued as they always had, shaped by forces that everyone understood. Then the strangers arrived. They came from across the ocean, from a world that operated by completely different rules. They wore strange clothes, spoke strange languages, carried strange weapons. They had pale skin and thick beards, and a hunger for land that seemed to have no limit. At first, they were few curiosities, potential trading partners, maybe potential allies against traditional enemies. But they kept coming, and they brought things that changed everything. Metal tools, iron pots that didn't break like clay, steel knives that held their edge, axes that could fell a tree in an hour instead of a day. Guns, loud, smoky, inaccurate at first, but deadly. A weapon that could kill from a distance without years of training. A weapon that changed the mathematics of warfare overnight. GHT. And invisible things, microscopic things, things that nobody understood. Smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, cholera. These diseases had evolved in Europe and Asia over thousands of years in dense populations living close to domesticated animals. Europeans had been exposed to them for generations. Their immune systems had adapted. Most Europeans who encountered these diseases survived. Native Americans had no such protection. They had been isolated from the Old World for at least 10,000 years. Their immune systems had never seen these pathogens. When the diseases arrived, they tore through native populations like wildfire through dry grass. The numbers are staggering. Historians estimate that between 1492 and 1600, the native population of the Americas fell by 90%. 90%. 9 out of 10 people dead within a century of contact. Some regions lost even more. The Caribbean islands, where Columbus first landed, were virtually depopulated within 50 years. The great civilizations of Mexico and Peru collapsed as much from disease as from Spanish swords. North of Mexico, the pattern repeated itself. Tribes that had never seen a European were devastated by diseases that traveled faster than the people who carried them. By the time settlers arrived in many regions, they found a landscape that had already been emptied. This is the grim foundation of everything that followed. Europeans didn't conquer a thriving, densely populated continent. They walked into a graveyard, a world that had already lost most of its people to invisible killers. The survivors faced impossible odds, and yet they fought. For 300 years across the entire continent, Native Americans resisted European expansion with every tool they had. They formed alliances, they adapted new weapons and tactics, they won battles, sometimes wars. They made the frontier the most dangerous place in the colonial world. But the collision of cultures created problems that no amount of courage could solve. The Europeans had rules for war, written codes, formal declarations, distinctions between soldiers and civilians. They expected their enemies to follow the same rules. When they didn't, Europeans were horrified. They called it savagery, terrorism. To Native Americans, European warfare was equally baffling. They watched soldiers line up in open fields, wearing bright uniforms, presenting easy targets. They watched armies refuse to fight in winter. They watched enemies surrender and expect mercy instead of death. Surrender, in most native cultures, didn't mean negotiation. It meant you belonged to whoever captured you, to ransom, to enslave, to kill. The idea of a white flag was foreign. The concept of civilian barely existed. Land ownership was another gulf that couldn't be bridged. Europeans saw land as property. You could own it, fence it, pass it to your children. Ownership was documented in writing, enforced by law, permanent. Native Americans generally saw land the way we might see the ocean. You traveled across it, hunted in it, lived on it seasonally, but you didn't own a piece of the earth any more than you owned a piece of the sky. So when Europeans arrived with pieces of paper that said, "This land is mine forever," native people often didn't understand what they were agreeing to. And when they did understand, they often didn't agree at all. Treaties were signed, hundreds of them, and broken, almost all of them. Native Americans broke treaties too. A treaty often meant to them a temporary pause, a strategic rest before the next season's raids. But native treaty violations were nothing compared to European ones. The United States government signed over 500 treaties with native nations. By any honest accounting, they broke every single one. The pattern was always the same. Make promises, take land, make more promises, take more land, push the boundary west, then push it again, then again. Every treaty was a stepping stone to the next betrayal. This isn't moral judgment. This is just what happened. Both sides committed atrocities. Both sides massacred civilians. Both sides tortured captives, burned villages, slaughtered women and children. The cycle fed on itself. Every atrocity demanded revenge. Every revenge created another atrocity. Hatred accumulated over generations until the very idea of peace became unthinkable. And through it all, the Europeans kept coming. More ships, more settlers, more soldiers, more guns. Against this tide, courage wasn't enough. Skill wasn't enough. Even the Comanche, the greatest warriors the continent had ever produced, couldn't hold back an entire civilization. The numbers were simply too unequal, the technology gap too wide, the diseases too deadly. What had been a collision became a conquest, and then an erasure. By the middle of the 19th century, the end was coming. Not all at once, not in a single decisive battle, but slowly, relentlessly, like a tide that never stops rising. The buffalo died first. For Plains tribes, the buffalo wasn't just food. It was everything. Shelter, hides stretched over poles to make teeps, clothing, tanned leather for shirts, dresses, moccasins, tools, bones shaped into needles, balls, scrapers. Fuel, dried dung burned for heat on the treeless plains. Religion. The buffalo was sacred, a gift from the Creator, the center of ceremonies and prayers. Remove the buffalo and the entire civilization collapsed. The American government understood this, maybe not officially, maybe not in writing, but they understood. Commercial hide hunters moved onto the plains in the 1870s. They weren't hunting for food. They were hunting for leather, buffalo hides that could be shipped east and turned into machine belts for the factories of the Industrial Revolution. They killed with industrial efficiency. A good hunter with a long-range rifle could drop a 100 buffalo in a day without moving from his position. The animals didn't run. They didn't understand what was happening. They just stood there while their herd was methodically destroyed. The hunters took the hides and left the carcasses to rot. The plains were carpeted with bones. The stench carried for miles. In 1870, there were perhaps 10 million buffalo on the southern plains. By 1880, there were almost none. 30 million animals killed in a decade. The largest mass slaughter of wildlife in human history. And with them went the way of life that had sustained the plains tribes for generations. Without buffalo, there was no food. Tribes that had never known hunger began to starve. The old, the young, the sick, they died first. Then, everyone else. Without buffalo, there was no economy, no hides to trade, no surplus to carry a tribe through a bad year. The wealth that had accumulated over generations evaporated. Without buffalo, there was no resistance. You can't fight a war when your people are starving. You can't raid when your horses are dying. You can't hold territory when you have nothing left to defend. One by one, the great tribes of the plains surrendered. The Comanche, the lords of the southern plains, the terror of 3 nations, came in from the cold in 1875. Their horses had been slaughtered. Their food stores had been destroyed. Their women and children were dying. Quanah Parker, the last great chief, led his band onto the reservation at Fort Sill. The Lakota held out longer. They won victories, spectacular ones. At Little Bighorn in 1876, they destroyed George Custer and 5 companies of the 7th Cavalry. It was the greatest Native American military triumph of the 19th century, and it changed nothing. Within a year, the Lakota were hunted down, scattered, forced onto reservations. Sit-in Bull fled to Canada. Crazy Horse surrendered and was killed while in custody. The Great Sioux Nation was Brock N. The last chapter was written at Wounded Knee in 1890. A band of Lakota already confined to a reservation was surrounded by U.S. soldiers. Someone fired a shot. No one knows who. The soldiers opened up with rifles and Hotchkiss guns. When the smoke cleared, at least 250 Lakota were dead. Many of them women and children. Many of them shot while trying to flee. Bodies were scattered across the snow for half a mile. It wasn't a battle. It was a massacre, and it was the end. After Wounded Knee, there was no more armed resistance. The Indian Wars were over. The tribes that had ruled this continent for thousands of years were confined to reservations, often the worst land in the most desolate places far from their ancestral territories. The children were taken. This is the part that doesn't get taught enough. Starting in the 1870s and continuing well into the 20th century, Native American children were forcibly removed from their families and sent to boarding schools. The explicit goal was cultural destruction. Kill the Indian, save the man. As one school founder put it, children were forbidden to speak their languages, forbidden to practice their religions, forbidden to wear traditional clothing or hairstyles. They were beaten for any expression of their heritage. They were given new names, dressed in European clothes, taught to be ashamed of their parents, their grandparents, everything they came from. Many never went home. Many died at the schools from disease, abuse, or neglect. Their bodies were buried in unmarked graves, far from their families, and their parents were never told. This continued until the 1960s. Within living memory, the population that had once numbered in the millions, 5 million, 10 million, maybe more, fell to fewer than 250,000 by 1900, a loss of over 95%. That is the scale of what happened. Not just military defeat, not just loss of territory, a near total destruction of peoples, cultures, languages, ways of life that had existed for thousands of years. The word for it is genocide, not because every death was intentional. Disease killed more than bullets ever did, and most of that disease was transmitted unintentionally. But the policies that followed, the broken treaties, the forced relocations, the deliberate destruction of the buffalo, the theft of children, the systematic assault on culture and identity. Those were choices made by over governments, documented in writing, carried out over generations. This is the history, not the simplified version, not the comfortable version, the real one. So, what survived after the wars, after the diseases, after the reservations, and the boarding schools, and the systematic attempts to erase everything? What's left? More than you might think. Today, there are over 5 million people in the United States who identify as Native American or Alaskan Native. The population that fell to 250,000 has grown back 20-fold. Not to its pre-cont levels, that may never happen, but the demographic collapse has reversed. There are 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States. Each one is a sovereign nation with its own government, its own laws, its own relationship with the federal government. Sovereignty is limited, compromised, constantly challenged, but it exists. It's more than most conquered peoples ever retained. Languages survive. Of the hundreds of languages spoken before contact, many are gone forever. No living speakers, no recordings, nothing but fragments in old documents. But others endure. Navajo is spoken by over 170,000 people. Cherokee, Ojib, Lakota, Chow. These languages, still taught, still learned, still used in homes and ceremonies. The fight to preserve them is desperate and ongoing. Most native languages are endangered, spoken mainly by elders, at risk of dying when the last fluent speaker dies. But the fight continues. Schools teach them. Apps help people learn them. Young people who grew up speaking only English are reclaiming the tongues of their grandparents. Traditions survive. Powwows draw thousands of people across the country, native and non-native alike, to celebrate dancing, drumming, singing, craftsmanship. They're not museum recreations. They're living events, evolving, adapting, incorporating new elements while honoring old ones. Ceremonies that were banned for decades are practiced openly again. The Sundance, the potlatch, the sweat lodge, religions that the government tried to stamp out, have emerged from hiding and found new generations of believers. Art survives. Native American artists work in every medium: painting, sculpture, film, literature, fashion, music. Some draw explicitly on traditional forms. Others blend influences in ways that defy categorization. The art scene is vibrant, diverse, internationally recognized. Names you might know: Joy Hadjo, the first Native American poet laureate; Sterling Hadjo, whose TV series Reservation Dogs won acclaim for its portrayal of contemporary Native life; Maria Tal Chief, the first major American prima ballerina; Jim Thorpe, still considered one of the greatest athletes in history. Political power survives. Native Americans have served in Congress, on federal courts, in state governments. Deb Haaland became the first Native American cabinet secretary in 2021, serving as Secretary of the Interior, the very department that once oversaw the reservation system. Tribal governments manage billions of dollars in economic activity. Some tribes have become wealthy through casino gaming, natural resources, or other enterprises. Others remain desperately poor, struggling with unemployment, addiction, and inadequate services. The range of outcomes is vast, and identity survives. This might be the most remarkable thing. After everything, the death, the displacement, the deliberate assault on culture, native identity endures. People know who they are. They know where they come from. They carry their history with them. Even when that history is painful, even when the dominant culture would prefer they forget. There's a concept in Lakota philosophy called Mita ku yasan. It means all my relations, or we are all related. It expresses a worldview in which everything is connected. Humans, animals, plants, the earth, the sky, the ancestors, the generations yet to come. That worldview didn't die. It couldn't be killed. It lives in the people who carry it forward, who teach it to their children, who practice it in their daily lives. The story isn't over. It's tempting to think of Native American history as something that ended, a tragedy that concluded in the 19th century, leaving only remnants and memorials. But that's not how the people who lived it see it. For them, the story continues. The struggles continue. The culture continues. The identity continues. They're not relics. They're not ghosts. They're not historical artifacts preserved under glass. They are people, living people with children and grandchildren, who will carry this forward into a future that hasn't been written yet. Whatever was lost, and so much was lost irretrievably, forever, something essential remains. And as long as it remains, the story goes on. So, where does that leave us? We started tonight with a question. What was life actually like for Native Americans? Not the simplified version, not the comfortable version, the real one. And the answer, as you've seen, is complicated. It was a life of profound beauty, connection to land that most modern people can't imagine. Communities bound together by kinship and tradition, skills honed over generations, hunting, tracking, crafting, surviving in environments that would kill most of us in days. It was also a life of violence, warfare woven into the fabric of many cultures, raiding and scalping and torture as accepted practices. Brutality that shocks our modern sensibilities, carried out by people who saw nothing wrong with it. It was a life transformed by contact with the outside world, horses that created empires, guns that shifted the balance of power, diseases that killed more people than any weapon ever could. And it was a life that ended, not entirely, but catastrophically. A 95% population collapse, languages silenced, territories stolen, children taken from their families and taught to be ashamed of who they were. None of this fits the simple stories we were taught. Native Americans weren't noble savages living in paradise until evil Europeans arrived. They weren't bloodthirsty warriors who deserved what they got. They weren't any of the cardboard cutouts that make history easy to digest. They were people capable of tremendous kindness and tremendous cruelty, capable of building civilizations and tearing them down, capable of adapting to change and being overwhelmed by it, just like the Europeans who came to their shores, just like us. The history is uncomfortable because it doesn't give us clear heroes and villains. It doesn't let us feel righteous or innocent. It implicates everyone and absolves no one. But maybe that's the point. Maybe real history, the kind that matters, is always uncomfortable. Maybe the truth is always messier than the stories we tell ourselves. And maybe acknowledging that mess, sitting with it, accepting it, refusing to simplify it, is the only way to actually learn from the past. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, you carry this history with you, not as a burden, but as a kind of knowledge, an awareness of the people who walked this land before you, the lives they lived, the world they lost. They are part of your story now, part of the long human chain that stretches backward into the darkness and forward into whatever comes next. We're all connected. Mitakwiro Yasin. All my relations. The story goes on. Sleep well.